The morning Isobel Carne arrived at Ashfield Manor, she counted 14 windows that faced the south garden. The same 14 her grandmother had counted every morning from the breakfast room below, and one Viscount who set a pair of mud-crusted riding boots on the hall table in front of her, without looking up from the letter in his hand. She picked them up. She had her reasons. The carriage that brought her to Ashfield had been hired from the village inn at Stoneford, the kind of carriage that arrived slightly damp and smelled of other people's journeys. Isobel had chosen it deliberately. She had also chosen the dress she wore, a dark wool traveling dress, plain at the collar, no lace, no adornment except the small pearl button at the cuff that had been her mother's and which she had moved to the inside seam before leaving so it didn't catch the light. She had stood in her lodgings in Halifax the morning she left and looked at herself in the glass and thought, yes, that is a woman no one will look at twice. The gates of Ashfield appeared through the carriage window just after 9:30. Isobel felt something move through her chest that she could not name quickly enough to stop it. Not grief. Grief was what she had felt the day her father died, the day the solicitor's letter arrived, the day she understood what her cousin intended to do with a house that did not belong to him. This was something older and quieter, something that had to do with the way the October light came down through the birch trees lining the approach and turned the leaves gold and particular, and exactly the same as they had always been. She had not been here in 4 years. The carriage stopped. Isobel waited the correct number of seconds, the length of time a woman in her position would wait for the driver to assist her, and then she stepped down. She allowed herself to look at the front of the house for no more than 3 seconds. Then she put it away, the way she had learned to put things away, and walked to the entrance. The housekeeper who received her was a narrow, capable woman named Mrs. Pelham, who had been at Ashfield for 6 years, and had therefore never known Isobel as anything other than the name on the letter of introduction. Her eyes assessed Isobel with the efficient courtesy of a woman accustomed to placing people correctly and quickly. Isobel let her look. She said her name was Miss Isobel Carne, that she had come in answer to the advertisement for a household secretary, that she hoped the journey's length had not made her late. Mrs. Pelham said she was precisely on time and led her inside. The entrance hall of Ashfield Manor smelled of old wood and something faintly mineral, the particular smell of stone houses in autumn, of fireplaces beginning their seasonal work. Isobel recognized it the way you recognize a voice before you see the face. She did not stop. She followed Mrs. Pelham across the hall and into the east passage, where the housekeeper explained in the measured tone of a woman who expected to explain things more than once that his lordship kept irregular hours, that Isobel's duties would be outlined that afternoon, that she would take her meals in the housekeeper's room until the household was better acquainted with her. They were midway down the passage when the door on the left opened. He was not what Isobel had expected, though she was not certain what she had expected. She had read her cousin's letters. She had spoken to the family solicitor in Halifax, who had described the Viscount Row in terms both careful and largely unflattering. A man of good family and uncertain finances. A man who had inherited a complicated situation and was managing it with incomplete information. She had formed a picture of someone older, perhaps, or harder. Someone who looked like a man holding something that wasn't entirely his. What she saw was a man of perhaps 32 pulling on his riding gloves with the abstracted energy of someone whose mind was already on a different problem than the room he was standing in. He was dark-haired, lean through the jaw, and he moved with the ease of a man who had grown up in large houses and stopped noticing them. He looked up at Mrs. Pelham, not at Isobel. "There's a horse gone lame in the east paddock," he said. "Send for Denton." His voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it. "And the boots from this morning are still in the passage. Have someone see to them." Mrs. Pelham said, "Yes, my lord," and turned slightly toward Isobel in the way of a woman about to make an introduction. She did not get the chance. The Viscount had already turned back through the door, reached without looking, and produced a pair of riding boots, genuinely, comprehensively muddy, the mud of a hard morning's ride across wet autumn fields, and held them in Isobel's general direction, not toward her specifically, toward the space she occupied, which was the space a household employee occupied, and therefore the space where boots requiring attention should logically go. Isobel looked at them. She thought of 14 windows. She thought of the breakfast room below them where her grandmother had eaten toast every morning for 40 years. She thought of the pearl button she had moved to the inside of her cuff. She took the boots. The Viscount was already walking. Mrs. Pelham watched him go with the particular stillness of a woman who had perfected the art of not reacting to things she'd seen before, and then she turned to Isobel with an expression that was not unkind. "I'll show you to your room," she said. "Thank you," Isobel said. "I'd appreciate that." She followed the housekeeper up the west staircase, the servant's stair, narrow and plain, not the stair she had run down as a child to reach the garden before breakfast. And she did not look at the walls, though she knew what hung on them, and she did not look at the window at the first landing, though she knew what it overlooked. She kept her eyes forward and her hands steady and the boots tucked under one arm, and she thought about nothing except where she was putting her feet. The room Mrs. Pelham gave her was at the far end of the upper corridor, small and clean, with a window that faced the kitchen garden. Not the south garden, not the birch trees. Isobel set the boots beside the washstand and went to the window and stood in the gray October light and looked at the kitchen garden below with its spent summer beds and the apple tree in the corner that she had climbed at age 7 and got stuck in for 40 minutes before her father's groundskeeper came and got her down. Without tree was still there. The apple tree was still there. She turned away from the window. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and reached into the inside pocket of her traveling coat and took out a letter. Her father's handwriting on the envelope. She did not open it. She held it for a moment, then set it on the bed beside her and looked at it the way you look at something you know very well that you are not yet finished needing. She had not come to Ashfield because she was lost. She had not come because she was afraid or without resources or without options. She had come because her father's letter told her exactly what to look for, and because some things, some truths, some inheritances, some corrections of old wrongs, could only be accomplished in the place where they had started. She picked up the muddy boots. She supposed she might as well begin. Isobel cleaned the boots thoroughly and returned them to the passage before noon without comment to anyone about their origin. That afternoon, Mrs. Pelham gave her a thorough outline of her duties. She was to manage the household correspondence, organize the estate records that had fallen into considerable disarray, and assist with the preparation of accounts that the Viscount's previous secretary, departed some weeks ago under circumstances Mrs. Pelham described only as unsatisfactory, had left incomplete. Isobel said she understood completely. She had excellent handwriting. She asked precise questions about the filing system and took notes in a small leather book and gave nothing away. She spent her first week learning what had changed and what hadn't. Some things hadn't. The third stair from the top of the west staircase still shifted under your weight if you stepped on the left side. The library door still needed lifting slightly on the handle before it would open. The smell of the east passage in the afternoon, old stone warmed by the residual heat of the fireplaces, something faintly like cedar from the hall chest, was precisely the smell of every afternoon of her childhood that she had spent in this house. Other things were different. Her father's study had been converted to an estate office, the furniture replaced, the bookshelves reorganized into filing, the portrait that had hung in the upstairs gallery. Her grandmother, in the double dress she wore every time someone pointed a painter at her, had been covered with a sheet, the way portraits were covered in houses that had changed hands and found certain images inconvenient. Isobel walked past it twice before she let herself stop. She stood in the gallery and looked at the shape beneath the sheet, the familiar height of it, the width of the frame, the particular forward tilt of her grandmother's painted chin, still visible in the silhouette. She reached out and touched the corner of the frame, just once. Soon she told it, not aloud, just the word placed there. She moved on. The groundskeeper was a man named Hartwell who had worked at Ashfield for 31 years. He was old in the way of men who have spent those years outdoors, his face weathered and his movements deliberate. And he had known Isobel since she was small enough to get stuck in apple trees. When he came around the corner of the kitchen garden wall on her second morning and saw her crossing the yard, he stopped. He removed his cap. Not a nod, not a courtesy gesture between staff. He removed his cap and held it against his chest with both hands, the way a man does when he is paying a very particular kind of respect. Isobel met his eyes. She gave the smallest possible shake of her head. Not yet. Hartwell put his cap back on. He said, "Morning, miss," in the voice of a groundskeeper acknowledging a secretary he had never met before, and went back to his work. That evening, Isobel found a small bunch of the last autumn roses from the south garden wall on her windowsill. They were tied with a length of garden twine. She put them in the water glass by the bed and did not allow herself to cry. She had made an agreement with herself about crying, and it was a firm one. The cook, a broad, warm woman named Mrs. Aldridge, had been at Ashfield for 12 years and had no reason to recognize Isobel. And yet on the third morning, when Isobel came to the kitchen to collect her own breakfast, she was not important enough to have it brought up, which suited her entirely. She found a tray set with considerably more than the plain portions allocated to household staff. Good bread, proper butter, a pot of the expensive tea she had noticed was kept locked in the pantry, and a small dish of the early winter preserves that Mrs. Aldridge produced each autumn in quantities she rationed carefully for guests. Isobel looked at the tray. She looked at Mrs. Aldridge, who was at the range with her back turned in the attitude of a woman who had decided not to be available for questions. "Mrs. Aldridge," Isobel said carefully, "I think this may be intended for someone else." "It isn't," said Mrs. Aldridge without turning. A pause. "I'm the household secretary." "I know what you are," said Mrs. Aldridge pleasantly, and turned around with an expression that made it clear the subject was closed. Isobel took the tray. She ate the good bread. She did not ask how Mrs. Aldridge knew, because some knowledge in old houses moved the way warmth moved through stone walls, invisibly and thoroughly, and without needing to be explained. The house knew her. She had not anticipated how much that would matter. It made her careful, because the house was not the only one paying attention. She noticed it first on the 5th day, in the estate office. She had been working through the previous secretary's filing, which was genuinely disorganized in ways that suggested haste rather than incompetence. When she became aware of someone in the doorway, she looked up. The Viscount was standing in the frame, not quite in the room. He was not doing anything particular. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has encountered something that doesn't fit the category he assigned it and is in the early stages of deciding whether to revise the category. Isobel looked back at him. She did not look away. "The Meridian tenant accounts," she said, as if she had known he was there. "The previous secretary filed them under the property name rather than the tenant name. It's consistent. but it makes cross-referencing the arrears ledger slower than it needs to be. I'd like to reorganize them, if that's acceptable." The Viscount said nothing for a moment. "Then, do it." He moved away from the door. Then, unexpectedly, he paused. "How did you know about the arrears ledger?" "I found it," Isobel said, "in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, Miss Fileld." He looked at her steadily. "Most people wouldn't have looked in the bottom drawer." "I was being thorough," Isobel said. He held her gaze a moment longer than was required for the exchange. Then he left. Isobel waited until she heard his footsteps reach the end of the hall. Then she let out a slow breath and went back to the filing. Her cousin arrived on a Friday. His name was Geoffrey Carne, and he was her father's nephew, her father's brother's eldest son, which made him a cousin by blood and something significantly less pleasant by character. He was 45, well-dressed in the way of men who want to appear wealthier than they are, and he had a face that arranged itself naturally into expressions of warmth and reason, which Isobel had learned to read correctly by the time she was 14. She was not in the entrance hall when he arrived. She had ensured that. She watched from the upper landing as he came in below, his coat taken, his hand extended to the Viscount with the practiced ease of a man who considered himself indispensable. She watched the Viscount receive him with his usual measured courtesy. She watched her cousin's eyes move across the entrance hall with the quick inventory of a man reminding himself of what he stood to gain. Her cousin looked up at the house, not at the landing where she stood. She had pulled back far enough. He looked at the house with an expression she had seen before, years ago, at her father's bedside in Halifax, in the pauses between his sentences about the estate's management, and what her father ought to have done differently. She recognized it now with the precision of someone who has had 4 years to study it. Entitlement. The expectation of ownership. She went back to the estate office and continued working on the arrears ledger, and said nothing to anyone, and breathed carefully. She had 10 days. She moved on the second night after her cousin's arrival. The document room was at the end of the east wing, behind a door that required a key from the housekeeper's ring. Isobel had identified the key on her 3rd day. She had also established, through the simple discipline of listening, that Mrs. Pelham slept deeply, and that the key ring hung on its hook in the housekeeper's room every evening from 10 o'clock onward. She did not take the key. She borrowed it. She returned it within 12 minutes, before the hall clock had moved past the quarter hour. In those 12 minutes, she moved through the document room with a candle and the systematic attention of someone who knows precisely what she is looking for. Her father had described it to her in the letter with the meticulousness of a man who understood that precision was the only reliable protection against careless disaster. In the wainscoting behind the document room fireplace, he had written, to the left of the mantelpiece, "There is a section that does not sit flush with the rest. Press at the lower corner. The space behind it is not large, but it is enough." The wainscoting was exactly where he had described it. The space behind it was dry and undisturbed. Inside, wrapped in the oilcloth her father had used for everything that mattered, was a sealed envelope. Isobel did not open it that night. She pressed the wainscoting back into place, returned the key, and went to bed with the envelope inside her traveling coat, hung behind the door. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling, and held very still, and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at Ashfield, to feel the edges of something that might eventually become relief. She opened the envelope the following morning before the household was awake. It contained 3 things: her father's will, signed and witnessed in the precise hand of a man who had known that precision was his only real weapon. A letter from his Halifax solicitor, confirming the will's validity and the location of the original filing, and a note in her father's handwriting that said only, "You found it. I knew you would. The house has always been yours." Come home. She read the note twice. Then she folded everything carefully back into the oilcloth, placed it in the inside pocket of her traveling coat, and went downstairs to the kitchen. Mrs. Aldridge gave her the good tea without comment. Hartwell came in from the kitchen garden with a basket of late potatoes and looked at her face and read it with the accuracy of someone who had known her family for 3 decades, and gave one slow nod. Isobel nodded back. The days that followed were the most precise she had yet navigated. Her cousin was charming at dinner. She could hear it from the corridor when she passed on her way to the housekeeper's room. She heard the ease of a man performing for an audience he considered entirely secured. He was working on the Viscount. She could hear the rhythm of it, the careful way her cousin shaped a conversation and then let it arrive where he needed it. She began to understand the shape of what he was doing on the 3rd evening when she paused outside the study door. The door, she had learned, did not close entirely unless you pulled it firmly from the inside. Her cousin, who was not yet familiar with the house's habits, had not known to pull it. She was not intending to listen. She had come to deliver a correspondence file that Mrs. Pelham had asked her to leave outside the study. She paused because she heard her own name. My cousin, her cousin was saying in the particular tone of a man sharing something painful out of duty. I feel it necessary to be frank with you, my lord, since I understand she has been taken on here as a secretary. She is my uncle's daughter, and I have genuine affection for her. But she has a history of making claims about property, about documents, about arrangements my uncle allegedly made before his death that have proven to be, I am sorry to say, entirely without foundation. I do not say this to damage her. I say it because she is unwell in ways that are not always visible, and if she has said anything to you regarding the estate, I think you should know the context before giving it weight. Silence. She has said nothing to me, the Viscount said, about anything. Good. Her cousin's voice settled. That is reassuring. Isobel stood in the corridor for 3 more seconds. Then she placed the correspondence file on the floor outside the door and walked away, because remaining any longer would have required her to make a decision about her hands that she was not ready to make. She delivered a letter for Mrs. Pelham. She reorganized 2 drawers of the filing cabinet that didn't need reorganizing. She went to her room and sat on the narrow bed and placed both hands flat on her knees and looked at the window that faced the kitchen garden and thought about her breathing, which required more effort than usual. She had known this was coming. She had known it for 4 years. Her cousin had been constructing this particular structure since before her father was in the ground, managing perception, ensuring that anything she claimed would arrive pre-discredited. She had known, and yet hearing it said in her father's house, to a man she had noticed this, had filed it away, begun to register her existence with something more than professional neutrality, produced in her chest a cold and specific anger she had not fully anticipated. She breathed through it. She was still breathing through it when the knock came at her door. Firm, unhurried, she stood. She opened the door. The Viscount stood in the corridor. His expression was controlled, but beneath it something had shifted, a tension she could not yet read. Your cousin tells me, he said without preamble, that you have made claims about this estate before, claims that were found to be groundless. Isobel looked at him. She felt the anger in her chest, cold and precise, and she made a choice. Did he show you my father's will? She said. The Viscount said nothing, not a description of it. Isobel continued, her voice even. Not a summary, the original document with my father's signature and the solicitor's seal. Did he show you that? Silence. My lord, Isobel said, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before. Not urgency, not desperation, but a quality of absolute steadiness that came from 4 years of waiting for exactly this moment. You are currently managing a property that you believe came to you through a legitimate process. Before you continue to do so, I would like to ask you one question. In all your dealings with Jeffrey Carne regarding this estate, have you ever seen the original will? Not a copy. The original. The Viscount held her gaze. Something moved in his expression. Not belief, not doubt, but the particular look of a man who has just identified a question he should have asked considerably earlier and did not ask. He did not answer. He did not need to. "Thank you," Isobel said. "That is what I thought." She began to close the door. He put one hand flat against it, not forcefully, just enough to stop it. "Miss Carne," he said. She waited. He seemed to be making a decision. Then he said, very quietly, "Be careful." It was not an apology. It was not a declaration of belief. It was two words that communicated, with minimal efficiency, that the calculation he was running had not resolved itself yet, but that he thought she should not walk down dark corridors alone. Isobel looked at his hand on the door. She looked at his face. "I have been careful," she said, "for quite some time." She did not close the door again. He removed his hand and walked back down the corridor, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go. And the cold anger in her chest settled into something harder and quieter and more durable. She had 8 days. She was in the estate office at 6 in the morning on the 7th day, working by lamplight, when she heard it, a sound from the east wing, careful, deliberate, the particular sound of someone moving through a space they believed was empty. The document room. Isobel was out of her chair before she had finished thinking. She took the candle from the desk, lit it, and walked to the east wing. The document room door was ajar, the lock disengaged. She pushed it open. Her cousin was on the far side of the room, a lamp in his hand, the wainscoting panel pulled away from the fireplace. He was staring at the empty space behind it. His face, when he turned and found her in the doorway in her dressing coat with her candle, moved through several expressions before settling on the one he had prepared for exactly this possibility. "My dear," he said, with the measured sorrow of a man who had rehearsed the line. "What are you doing here?" "The same thing you are," Isobel said. "Except I've already finished." Her cousin went very still. "It isn't there," Isobel said. She kept her voice as level as she could make it. "Whatever you came to find, it hasn't been there for 5 days." He looked at her face. He was reading it, the way he had read people's faces all his life, looking for the seam where the composure broke, where the uncertainty lived. She gave him nothing. "You should go to bed," she said. She held the door open. After a long moment, her cousin walked past her and out into the corridor without a word. She watched him go. When his footsteps had receded entirely, she returned to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, put one hand over the envelope inside her coat, and held it there in the dark. 7 days. She could do 7 days. The morning after the document room, her cousin found her in the housekeeper's room at breakfast. He sat down without being invited. He looked at her with the expression he had settled on since the previous night. Careful, recalibrated, stripped of the warmth he'd discarded because she had declined to receive it. "You have something," he said. "Good morning," Isobel said. "Don't." His voice dropped. This, she understood, was the real voice. She had heard it once before, years ago, through a door she hadn't been meant to stand behind, when he had told her father that his management of the estate was an embarrassment to the family. Her father had said nothing. She had memorized the sound of it. "You have something. Tell me what it is." "I have toast," Isobel said, "which is very good this morning." "Whatever you think you've found, it won't hold. I have spent 4 years managing this situation. The legal groundwork is laid. Any claim you make will be challenged before it reaches a magistrate, and by the time the challenge is resolved, you will have used up the time your father gave you, and the deadline will have passed." He leaned forward slightly. "You know about the deadline?" "Yes," Isobel said. 1 year from the date of death to file the inheritance claim in person before a legal witness. It expires in 7 days. Her cousin looked at her. Then you understand? I understand perfectly, Isobel said. She set down her own cup. She looked at him across the breakfast table with the particular honesty of two people who have decided, mutually and without announcement, to stop performing. I also understand that you began this 4 years ago. My father was ill for 2 years before he died. You started before he was gone. Her cousin said nothing. I know, Isobel said, flat, factual. The way you state things you have known for a long time and are done pretending otherwise. I want you to understand that I know, not to make you feel caught, simply so that neither of us wastes the other's time. She stood. She smoothed her skirt. She picked up her cup. I believe you're expected in the estate office at 9, she said. I would use the time before then to think carefully about what you intend to say. She left him at the table. The knock at the estate office door came that afternoon, when she had expected it. The Viscount came in without waiting for an answer, which she had observed was characteristic of him when he had made a decision and was implementing it before he could reconsider. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her with the expression she had begun to catalogue but could not yet fully read. Your cousin came to see me this morning, he said. I expected he would. He told me you are. The Viscount paused, selecting the word with visible care. Not reliable. That any document you might produce should be treated with significant caution. Yes, Isobel said, he's been building that case for 4 years. The Viscount was quiet. He moved to the window and stood with his back partly to her, looking at the south garden below. The October light came through at a low angle and put shadows along the line of his jaw. He also told me, the Viscount said, more slowly, that you were in the document room last night. We were both in the document room last night, Isobel said. He arrived first. A pause. What was he looking for? The same thing I found 5 days ago. The silence that followed this was different in quality from the one she had catalogued before. It was the silence of a man reassembling several things he had understood in one order and now understood in another. You found something, the Viscount said. 5 days ago, and said nothing. I was waiting, Isobel said, to understand what kind of man you were. He turned from the window. He looked at her directly. And have you? It was a genuine question. She could hear it, not defensive, not rhetorical. He actually wanted to know. Isobel looked at him, at the controlled line of his expression and the steadiness with which he was holding her gaze, and the fact that she had been in this house for over 2 weeks and had watched him daily and had not once seen him be deliberately cruel. I think, she said carefully, that you came into this situation with incomplete information and made decisions based on what you were given. I think my cousin managed what you were given very carefully. I think you are not his instrument, which was not something I was certain of when I arrived. The Viscount was quiet for a moment. That is not entirely a compliment. No, Isobel agreed, but it is what I think. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her desk, which was not the posture of a man maintaining formal distance. He leaned forward slightly. He looked at her. Show me, he said. Isobel reached into the inside pocket of her dress, where she had moved the envelope that morning, and placed it on the desk between them. He looked at it. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it the way you look at something you understand is going to change the shape of what you knew before. Then he picked it up and read. He read slowly and completely, which she appreciated. She watched his face and saw the moment he reached the ownership clause in the will, because something in the set of his jaw shifted. He read the solicitor's letter. He read her father's note last. He was still for a long time after he finished. Then he set the documents down with the care of someone handling something that is not theirs to be careless with, and he looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me," he said, "when you arrived?" She had prepared a careful answer for this. She did not give it. "I needed to know," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, "what you would do with the power to ruin me before I handed it to you." He said nothing. "My cousin has spent 4 years making certain that my word alone is worth nothing," Isobel continued. "If I had arrived at Ashfield and announced myself, you would have had 2 choices. Believe me or believe him, and you had no reason at all to believe me." She paused. "I have known people who would have used what I gave them against me. I needed to know whether you were one of them." The Viscount was very still. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the neutrality she had catalogued in the early days, not the assessing quality she had come to recognize. Something with less protection in it than anything she had observed from him so far. "The boots," he said. His voice was different. "Yes," Isobel said, "the boots." He stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, and she watched the stillness of his shoulders and understood it for what it was. Not composure, but the controlled effort of a man working very hard on something inside himself. "The deadline," he said. 7 days. He turned around. "I need to go to Halifax," he said. "Tonight. You'll come with me." She looked at him. "The will is legitimate," he said. "I am not questioning it. But your cousin will challenge the filing the moment it happens, and he will do it with every resource he has. You need a witness whose testimony cannot be easily set aside." He held her gaze. "I am a Viscount. My testimony is not easily set aside." Isobel said nothing for a moment. "Why?" she said, genuinely. She wanted to know. He seemed briefly caught off guard by the question. Then, with the slight effort of a man saying something true that costs him something, "Because it is the right thing to do." A pause. "And because I handed you a pair of boots." Isobel looked at him for a long moment. "The lace on my left boot is coming undone," she said. He blinked. "I'm not serious," she said. She stood, placed the documents carefully inside her dress, and smoothed her skirt. "I'll be ready within the hour." She moved to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. "My lord," she said. He looked at her. "My father's note," she said, "the one at the bottom of the envelope. I'd like it returned when this is finished." "Of course," he said. She nodded. She left. They rode out at 10 that night. 2 horses, no carriage. Because he had looked at her small trunk and at the horses and said they would make better time, and asked whether she could ride. She had told him she had grown up at Ashfield, and he had accepted this without comment and helped her mount with the practical efficiency of a man solving a logistical problem, and they went out through the rear gate and down the back lane in the dark. She had ridden this lane as a child. In the dark, with the smell of the autumn fields around her and the sound of hooves on the packed earth lane, the familiarity of it came at her in a way she hadn't prepared for. She rode behind him for the first mile and thought about the estate office and what he had said, and arrived at no conclusion except that she would know more when it was over. They stopped at a coaching inn past midnight to rest the horses. He ordered tea and bread, and they sat across a rough table in the empty front room. "Your cousin will know by morning," he said. "Yes, he'll go to the estate office first, find me gone, then find you gone. Mrs. Pelham will tell him we left together because she is honest and because he will press her." "She might not," the Viscount said, in a tone that suggested he knew his housekeeper better than she knew. "She might not," Isobel allowed, "but he will assume Halifax regardless. He'll send a rider. He won't get there before us." "No, but we need to be at the solicitor's office by 10, before his rider arrives and before he can file anything to complicate the process." She set down her cup. "Do you understand the importance of 10 o'clock? "I understood the importance of 10 o'clock, he said, with a dryness that surprised her almost into smiling. "Before we left." They reached Halifax in the gray early morning. The solicitor's office was on Bedford Row, and the man himself, Mr. Holt, small and thorough, and the most careful reader Isobel had ever watched, opened the door before they could knock. He looked at Isobel with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something he was not certain would arrive, and then he looked at the Viscount behind her, and his expression underwent a rapid and visible revision. "Miss Carne," he said. "Mr. Holt," she said. "This is Viscount Row. He is here as a witness." Mr. Holt looked at the Viscount for a moment longer. Then he stood back from the door. What followed was 2 hours of the most meticulous legal work Isobel had witnessed. Mr. Holt asked her questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable. He read every document twice. He asked the Viscount, at one point, whether he was prepared to sign a statement attesting to the document's presentation and condition, and to stand behind that statement if it was challenged. "Mr. Holt," the Viscount said, with patience that had a very slight edge beneath it, "I have ridden through the night to sit in this room. I am prepared." Mr. Holt accepted this and returned to his documents. At 11:43 in the morning, Isobel signed her name to the formal claim. Mr. Holt signed below it. The Viscount signed as witness. The seal went down into the wax. Mr. Holt set down the seal and looked at her. "The claim is properly filed, Miss Carne," he said quietly. "Ashfield Manor is yours." Isobel looked at the document on the desk, at her name on it, and her father's name above it, and the seal that made it real in the way the oilcloth envelope had always been real but had never quite felt until this moment. "Thank you, Mr. Holt," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. They came out onto Bedford Row at noon exactly. The gray Halifax morning was cold and particular, smelling of stone and the season turning. Isobel stood on the pavement and breathed and felt something shift inside her that she could not name quickly. Not triumph, not relief, but something older, something that had to do with her father and the apple tree in the kitchen garden and the portrait covered with a sheet in the upstairs gallery. The Viscount stood beside her. "It will still be challenged," he said. "Yes, Geoffrey will file a counterclaim within the week. There will be proceedings. It will take time, but the deadline is met. The deadline is met." He was quiet. Then, with some effort, as if the words required assembly, "I owe you considerably more than an apology for the boots." Isobel looked at him in the morning light, away from Ashfield, away from the structures of household and position. He looked tired, not weak, just a man who had ridden through the night and said something true that cost him something. "You owe me nothing," she said. He turned to look at her. "That isn't. You owe me nothing," she said again, more quietly. "You came when it mattered. You signed what needed to be signed, that is." She paused. "That is considerably more than I had any right to expect." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his expression that she chose, deliberately, not to examine too closely. "We should eat," he said, "before we ride back." They found a quiet dining room near the waterfront and ate a proper meal and talked about things that did not matter legally. She mentioned the bookshops near the Granville Street Market. He said he had not been in a bookshop in nearly 3 years, which she told him was a significant personal failing. He looked briefly startled. Then, unexpectedly, for the first time in all her observation of him, he almost smiled. She filed it away without comment. They rode back to Ashfield in the afternoon, arriving in the long October evening. She was thinking of her room, of the narrow bed, of sleeping without the weight of the deadline on her, when they came through the front entrance and found Mrs. Pelham in the hall with an expression that stopped Isobel where she stood. "My lord," Mrs. Pelham said, and then with a careful precision, "Miss Carne." The way she said it was wrong. "What has happened?" the Viscount said. "Mr. Geoffrey Carne," she said, "spoke at some length with Mrs. Aldridge and 2 of the upstairs staff this morning before he left." A pause. "He left them with a particular impression of Miss Carne's." She chose the word with visible care. Of her intentions here, the staff are uncertain. Another pause. And Mrs. Aldridge, in light of what she was told, has asked me to convey that she does not feel she can continue to provide Miss Carne with meals in the housekeeper's room. The entrance hall was very quiet. Isobel looked at the floor of the entrance hall. The same stone flags it had always been. She looked at the mark on the left wall where the hall chest had stood for 20 years before someone moved it. She looked at the Viscount. His face was controlled. But beneath the control, something was working that she could not read in time. He said nothing, and Isobel understood, in the way you understand things that arrive whole, and without warning, that this moment, standing in his entrance hall, between the staff's uncertainty and the knowledge of what she carried in her coat, was a different kind of moment than the solicitor's office had been. In Halifax there had been a correct action available to him, a clear, practical thing to do with a right answer. He had done it without hesitation. This was not that. This was the entrance hall of his household and his staff, and the shape of what he owed his own standing, and the silence stretched. Isobel made the decision for him. "Thank you, Mrs. Pelham," she said. Her voice was even. She was very good at even. "I'll pack my things, Miss Carne," the Viscount said. "It's quite all right," she said. She did not look at him. "I have what I came for. I'll be no more than an hour." She walked past Mrs. Pelham and up the stairs, and down the corridor to her small room, and closed the door, and stood in the middle of it, with her traveling coat still on, and the envelope against her ribs. She allowed herself 20 seconds. Then she opened her trunk and began to fold things into it, methodically, one item at a time, because the hands needed occupation when the mind could not afford to be occupied. She had nearly finished when she saw the roses on the windowsill. Hartwell's roses, replaced twice now from the south garden wall. They were past their best, petals beginning to loosen. Béchalet. She looked at them for a moment. Then she left them where they were, closed her trunk, and sat at the small writing desk and wrote a letter. She wrote for several minutes in the careful hand her father had taught her. When she finished, she folded the letter, did not seal it, and left it on the desk. She carried her own trunk downstairs. Mrs. Pelham was in the hall and moved to help. Isobel declined with a smile. She asked for a carriage to the Stoneford coaching inn. She stood in the entrance hall and waited, and did not look at the east passage where the covered portrait was. The Viscount came down the stairs. He came down them with the look of a man who had reached a decision and found it cost him something, and was coming to deliver it anyway. She watched him descend and thought, there it is. He reached the bottom. He stopped. He looked at her trunk. He looked at her. He opened his mouth. "Please, don't," Isobel said. He closed it. "Whatever you are about to say," she said quietly, "I'd rather you didn't. I am tired and the claim is filed, and I am going to be perfectly fine." She paused. "I always have been." She picked up her trunk. She walked out the front door of Ashfield Manor into the autumn evening. The carriage came. She got in. She did not look back at the house as they drove away through the birch trees, the gold leaves coming down in the early dark. She held the envelope with one hand and the edge of the seat with the other, and she breathed and watched the road and did not think about the expression on his face at the bottom of the stairs. She was very good at not thinking about things she had decided not to think about. In the room she had left behind, on the writing desk by the window that faced the kitchen garden, the letter sat open. It said, "My lord, the document room key is with Mrs. Pelham. I borrowed it twice. She may not have noticed, but you should know. The roses along the south garden wall want cutting back before the first frost. Hartwell knows how my grandmother preferred it done, if anyone thinks to ask him. The portrait in the upstairs gallery is my grandmother. Her name was Frances Carne, née Alderton. She was painted at 24, and she is wearing the gray dress because my grandfather asked her to, and she never could refuse him anything, he asked gently. I would like it uncovered when the house is mine again. I would like it to stay in the gallery where the afternoon light reaches it at 3 o'clock. I do not write this to make you feel a particular way. I write it because these things should be known by whoever lives in this house, and you have lived in it, and perhaps you will remember. Thank you for Halifax. I mean that qualification. Isobel Carne. He read it standing at the writing desk in the small room that smelled faintly of roses. He had come looking for her 35 minutes after she left. He had stood in the entrance hall for 20 of those minutes, saying nothing to anyone, and then he had gone upstairs. He read the letter twice. He stood at the window and looked at the kitchen garden in the dark and thought about a woman who had arrived at his house with a hired carriage and a plain dress and a ring worn stone inward, and had cleaned his boots without comment and waited with a patience he was only now fully understanding the depth of. He thought about what he had done at the bottom of the stairs. He had done nothing. He had stood there and watched her carry her own trunk out the front door of her own house, and he had told himself that the legal matter was resolved, that she was protected, that the household needed time to adjust, that there were reasons, sensible, practical, legitimate reasons, for the silence. He had been a coward. Not on the road, not in Halifax, not in Het. Moment when the correct action had been clear, and he had taken it. Only here, in the one moment that had not been clear, that had only been a choice between the shape of things as they were and the expression on Isobel Carne's face. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. He went downstairs. He found Mrs. Aldridge in the kitchen, and he told her, concisely and without elaboration, what had been filed in Halifax that morning, and what it meant, and who Isobel Carne was and had always been. Mrs. Aldridge listened with the expression of a woman, absorbing information that confirmed rather than surprised, and when he finished, she pressed her lips together in the specific way of a woman who has something to say about having been deceived into doubting her own instincts. He went to find Hartwell. Hartwell was in the stable yard. The old man looked at him with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who had been waiting a long time for something and was now evaluating whether the wait had been worth it. The Stoneford coaching inn, the Viscount said. She left. He checked his watch. 50 minutes ago. How long does the evening coach to Halifax wait on a Thursday? Hartwell looked at him for a moment. Thursdays it's late, he said. Driver takes supper first. Usually waits till 8:30. It's 8:15, the Viscount said. It is, said Hartwell. The Viscount looked at him. The roses along the south wall, he said. She wants them cut back before the frost, her grandmother's way. Something shifted in Hartwell's face, not surprise, but the expression of a man whose patience has been very long and who is watching it finally amount to something. I know how, he said. Been waiting to be asked. The Viscount nodded. He mounted and he rode. The road to Stoneford was 3 miles, and he covered it in the dark with the focused certainty of a man who knows exactly what he should have done 2 hours ago and is correcting it with everything available to him. He did not work out what he would say when he got there. Some things could not be prepared for. Some things you simply had to arrive at. The coaching inn at Stoneford was lit and warm, the evening coach still in the yard. He went inside. He scanned the room. She was in the far corner, her trunk beside her, her traveling coat on, a cup of tea in front of her. She was sitting with the stillness she always had, looking at nothing in particular, and she had not yet seen him. He crossed the room. She looked up when he was a few feet away, and her face, her composed, steady, self-contained face, did something he had never seen it do before. The composure held, and then it didn't, quite, and what was underneath it for one unguarded moment was something he felt in his chest with a clarity that left no room for uncertainty. She recovered, of course. "My lord," she said. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. He sat down across from her without ceremony, leaned forward, and looked at her directly, because he had ridden 3 miles in the dark specifically to look at her directly, and he was not going to be indirect about it. "I stood at the bottom of the stairs," he said, "and I said nothing." She said nothing. "That was wrong," he said. "Not legally. You are protected. The claim is filed. But you walked out of your own house carrying your own trunk, and I stood there and watched you go. I had reasons. They seemed like reasons at the time. They were not. They were the habits of a man who is accustomed to managing difficult situations from a careful distance and calling it good judgment." She looked at him with the expression he had been trying to categorize since approximately the 5th day and had now decided he would simply accept not categorizing. "Your staff," she began. "I spoke to Mrs. Aldridge," he said. "She knows everything. She also has opinions about having been misled, which she expressed with considerable feeling, and which I deserved." He paused. "Hartwell knows. Mrs. Pelham knows. The household will adjust." Something moved at the corner of Isobel's mouth. "The proceedings will begin soon," he said. "Geoffrey will contest. Mr. Holt estimates 6 to 8 weeks for formal resolution. During that time the estate is in a complicated position." He held her gaze. "I would like you to come back to Ashfield, not as a secretary, as its owner, while the proceedings resolve." She looked at him. "There is something else," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a letter. Smaller than the will, the paper older, the handwriting faded but legible. He set it on the table. "This was in my father's correspondence," he said. "I found it when I inherited. I read it then and didn't fully understand it. I understand it now." She picked it up. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name at the top was not. "Dear William," it began. William had been his father's name, and Isobel read it with the stillness she brought to everything. And he watched her face as she read, and he saw the moment she understood what it was. Her father, years ago, had written to his father, 2 men who had known each other in the way of neighbors and occasional friends, who had trusted each other without ceremony. The letter asked one thing. If anything should happen to me, her father had written, and Isobel is left to navigate it alone, she will not ask for help. She does not know how. Watch for her if you can. She is more capable than anyone will give her credit for, and she will need someone willing to see past the not asking. Isobel held the letter for a long moment after she finished reading. Then she set it down carefully on the table between them. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the coach driver was calling the final boarding. Neither of them moved. "He knew your father," Isobel said. "Apparently," he said, "better than either of us knew." A silence. "You said," she said carefully, "in the estate office, you said you needed to know what kind of man I was." He waited. "Do you know now?" She looked at him for a long moment, at the thoroughness with which he was looking back at her, at the fact that he had ridden through one night for a legal document and through a second night for an entirely different reason, and was sitting in a Stoneford coaching inn at nearly 9 o'clock on a Thursday looking at her with the expression she had stopped trying to name because some things were clearer without names. "I think," she said slowly, "that you are a man who rides 3 miles in the dark to a coaching inn because he stood at the bottom of a staircase and said nothing and could not let that be the last thing." He held her gaze. "That is a very specific answer. I am a very specific person," Isobel said. The coach driver called again. Isobel looked at her trunk. She looked at the door. She looked at the man across the table who was looking back at her, without any of the careful distance she had watched him maintain for weeks. "The portrait," she said. "Uncovered before you return," he said, "tonight." She looked at him for another moment. Then she stood, went to the door, spoke to the coachman, and came back. She picked up her trunk. She picked up her father's letter from the table. She looked at him. "Well then," she said. Well then, he said. They walked out of the coaching inn together into the cold October night, and above them the sky was enormous and clear, the way autumn skies in Nova Scotia sometimes were after rain, and the road back to Ashfield stretched ahead of them pale and certain in the dark. 1 year later, Ashfield Manor in June was a particular kind of beautiful that Isobel had carried in her memory through 4 years of rented rooms and careful waiting, and the long discipline of patience held past the point where patience is comfortable. She had known, in the abstract, that it would be like this. Knowing and standing inside it were different things. She had learned, in the year since she rode Akrubik through the birch trees on a Thursday night, to stand inside good things without holding them at a slight distance in case they proved temporary. They had not proved temporary. The legal proceedings had taken 11 weeks. Geoffrey Carne had challenged the will's execution, the witness testimony, the filing date, and the physical condition of the document, and Mr. Holt had addressed each challenge with the unhurried precision of a man who had been preparing for exactly this opposition considerably longer than Geoffrey had been preparing to mount it. The Viscount's testimony had been, as he had said it would be, not easily discredited. Ashfield was formally returned to Isobel Carne on a Thursday morning in January. Mr. Holt's letter had arrived at the breakfast table. She had read it and set it down and looked out the window at the winter garden for a long moment. Across the table he had looked at her face and said, "Is it done?" "It's done," she said. He had reached across the table and taken her hand, briefly and without ceremony, and she had let him, and that had been enough. Geoffrey Carne had left the county before the proceedings concluded. His name was not spoken at Ashfield, which was not a rule anyone stated and everyone observed. The proceedings had also surfaced, in their 9th week, certain irregularities in Geoffrey's management of the estate finances over the preceding 4 years. Mr. Holt had referred the matter to the appropriate parties. Isobel had been informed, had noted it, and had moved forward, which was what she did. What she had not moved forward from, what she had moved steadily and deliberately toward, at the pace that both of them seemed to need, was him. She had started thinking of him by his given name, Frederick, sometime in the 3rd week after her return. She had not mentioned it to him. He had started calling her Isobel sometime in the same period, not Miss Carne, just Isobel, and neither of them had remarked on the transition. They had talked. This was the central fact of it, not the legal resolution, not the social arithmetic of their positions, not what the county made of the arrangement, which had been surprised and then rapidly accepting in the way that counties were when a Viscount made his intentions unambiguous. They had talked, over many evenings in the library and in the south garden, and on horseback along the eastern fields, where the conversation had room to breathe. He had asked her one evening in February, with the directness that she had come to understand was his particular form of gentleness, whether she would consider making the arrangement permanent. He had not said the logical thing, had not said anything that sounded assembled. He had said, "I have been trying to imagine this house without you in it, and I find I cannot do it, which I am fairly certain means something, and I would rather know what you think it means than spend another winter being sensible about it." She had said yes, not with ceremony, just yes. Now it was June, and Ashfield was full of light. The portrait of her grandmother had hung uncovered in the upstairs gallery since the night Isobel returned from the Stoneford coaching inn. The afternoon light reached it at 3 o'clock and turned the gray dress in the painting warm and particular, and Isobel stopped to look at it most days as she passed. Hartwell had cut the South Garden roses back in October, in the way he had learned from her grandmother, and maintained through all the years of merely maintaining things, waiting to be asked to do them properly. They had come back in June with the lavish abundance of plants that have been properly tended after years of neglect, and the morning Isobel first saw them fully bloomed. She had stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, her hands around her tea, and felt something close that had been open a long time. Mrs. Aldridge still gave her the good tea. This had simply become the order of things. She had, in the months after the proceedings concluded, produced a preserved plum cake at Sunday breakfast that she set on the table without comment, and which was understood by everyone to be an apology for the week she had doubted her own instincts, and which Isobel had accepted by eating 2 slices and saying it was excellent, which it was. In the entrance hall, on the narrow shelf beside the door, beneath the glass case that Frederick had made by a craftsman in Stoneford and installed one Sunday morning, without telling her what he was doing until it was done, a pair of mud-crusted riding boots sat on a square of dark cloth. He had not cleaned them. She had asked why, laughing, and he had said that cleaning them would have been beside the point. She had looked at them in their case and understood that he was right. Guests always asked. There was something about a display case in an entrance hall that made asking irresistible. Someone at every dinner would find themselves unable to walk past it without asking about the boots. The evident deliberateness of the display suggested a story, and there was always someone unable to resist discovering what it was. Isobel always answered. She told it simply, the way her father had taught her to tell things, without embellishment, without false modesty, without the performance of either. She told it as it had been, a woman who arrived in her own house, without announcing herself, who picked up a pair of boots and said nothing, and waited because she had learned that some truths needed time and the right witness before they could be properly seen. Frederick listened every time. He stood at the edge of whatever room they were in with the expression she had long since stopped trying to name. And when she reached the part about the coaching in, he always looked at her in the particular way she had come to know, and she always looked back. He told his version occasionally. It was shorter. It ended with, "I stood at the bottom of the stairs and said nothing, and then I got on a horse." He said this with the self-deprecation of a man who has honestly earned his peace with a specific failure. Isobel always said he got on a horse at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night and rode 3 miles in the dark, and she would like that on the record. It was always on the record. On an evening in late June, a year and some weeks from the morning, Isobel had stepped out of a hired carriage in a plain wool dress and walked back into her family's house. For the first time in 4 years she sat in the south garden as the light came down. The roses were at their height, late, the air was warm and still, the particular warmth of a Nova Scotia summer evening that she had carried in memory all through the years of waiting. Frederick came and sat beside her. He said nothing immediately, which was one of his better qualities. He sat with the ease of a man in a place that fit him, and she sat beside him with the same ease, and the garden settled into evening around them. After a while he said, "Hartwell says the climbing roses on the east wall want training before they get any further." "I know," Isobel said. "I told him to go ahead. He was waiting for you to tell him. He always waits for me." A pause. "You've been telling this garden what to do since you were small," he said. "Since I was 8, Isobel said. "Before that I was just listening to it." He looked at her. She looked at the roses. The evening light was the particular gold of a long summer day at its end, the kind of light that did not last, and she was paying attention to it in the way she had learned to pay attention to good things, fully, without the old instinct to hold back. She had been patient for a very long time. She was done with that kind of patience now. She had the house and the garden and the man sitting beside her who had ridden through 2 nights for 2 different reasons and had never, in all the months since, given her any reason to regret telling the coachman she would not be taking the Thursday coach to Halifax. She reached out and took his hand. He turned it over, and held hers back, quietly and completely, the way he did everything she had come to rely on. In the entrance hall, in their case on the dark cloth, the muddy boots sat exactly where he had put them. And every guest who asked was told the same story, the story of a woman who had learned that waiting with intention was its own kind of courage, and that some houses, some truths, some people were worth every quiet, careful, deliberate day of the wait. She never mentioned that the woman was herself. She never needed to.